The file landed on the judge's bench with a sound I will never forget. Not a slam, not a thud, just a quiet, definitive weight settling onto wood. Margaret Hollis had spent 4 hours calling me a ghost. No real family. No real history. No real reason a woman like me could possibly love her son without wanting something in return. She was still talking when the bailiff carried that envelope up from the back of the room. Red border. Langley, Virginia return address. I watched her attorney open it. I watched the color leave his face the way water leaves a cracked glass. Slowly. Then all at once, I didn't smile. I didn't need to. Before we get into how that morning unfolded, drop your country and your local time in the comments right now. I want to know who's listening. A few hours earlier, I was sitting in my car in the parking garage beneath the Moakley Federal Courthouse, eating a granola bar I didn't taste, and listening to the heat tick out of the engine. It was 7:41 in the morning. I had been awake since 3:15. Not from nerves, exactly. I stopped feeling nerves the way most people feel them somewhere around my second deployment, when the body learns that adrenaline is expensive and starts rationing it. What kept me up was something older and quieter than nerves. It was the specific exhaustion of being asked to prove you are real. I am 43 years old. I have held a security clearance at a level I am still not permitted to name in full. I have spent the better part of 2 decades doing work that, if it appeared in a newspaper, would be described with words like covert and sensitive and eyes only. And on this particular Tuesday morning in October, I was about to walk into a courtroom and sit across a table from my mother-in-law while she told a federal judge that I did not exist in any way that mattered. I finished the granola bar, folded the wrapper into a neat rectangle the way I always do. Old habit, leave no trace, even of breakfast. Then I sat for another minute with my hands in my lap and looked at the concrete wall in front of me. Derek had texted at 6:58. I'll be there. Seat on your side, that was all. No punctuation at the end, which meant he was as hollowed out as I was. 14 months is a long time to not be able to call your husband. I knew that going in. I accepted the terms of the assignment the way you accept weather. You don't argue with it, you just dress accordingly. But Derek had not been briefed on those terms. Derek had been told exactly what my cover allowed me to tell him, which amounted to, I have to go away for a while, and I can't tell you where, and I can't tell you when I'm coming back. He had waited 8 months before his mother convinced him I was gone for good. I don't blame him for that. I want to be clear about that, because it matters. I have run enough operations to know that the person with no information is always the most vulnerable person in any room. Derek had no information. Margaret had an agenda and a law degree and 40 years of practice filling silences with the version of events that suited her best. Of course he started to believe her. Of course he did. What I blamed her for, what I still blame her for on the days I allow myself to blame anyone, is that she knew more than she let on. I didn't know that yet, sitting in the parking garage. I would know it by afternoon. But there was already something that had bothered me for months, a small splinter of a thing I kept probing without being able to name. How had the separation paperwork been filed so quickly? How had her attorney known exactly which accounts to freeze, which property records to pull, which timeline to build, all within the first 60 days of my absence? 14 months overseas, 2 weeks back on American soil. Then a summons. The speed of it had felt less like grief and more like preparation. I picked up my bag, plain black canvas, nothing that announced anything about me, and got out of the car. My heels on the concrete made a sound I found briefly annoying. I had worn the low pumps on purpose, charcoal gray, the most unremarkable shoes I owned. My attorney, Sandra Osai, had advised me to look soft. Not weak, she'd said. Soft. There's a difference. Soft is non-threatening. Soft makes juries and judges want to protect you. You walk in there looking like what you are, Zara, and Margaret Hollis wins before she opens her mouth. What I am. I had rolled that phrase around for a while after Sandra said it. I took the elevator up to the lobby. The courthouse in the morning has a particular smell. floor wax and old paper, and the faint ghost of someone's coffee from 2 floors up. I have been in harder rooms than this, rooms with no exits marked, with no guarantee of daylight. A courtroom, I reminded myself, is a room where everyone has to follow rules. There is something almost restful about that. If you know how rules work, Sandra was waiting near the security line, a slim woman in her early 50s with natural hair pulled back and glasses she only wore in court. She looked at me the way she always did. Quick assessment, top to bottom, slight nod. You sleep? She asked. Some. Derek's already inside. Margaret's team got here at 7. 3 attorneys. She paused. 3. I counted on 4, I said. Sandra looked at me sideways. Why 4? Margaret doesn't like to lose resources on a sure thing. If she only brought 3, she's already nervous about something. Sandra absorbed that. Then, the document. Did Langley confirm? They confirmed last night at 11:42. Courier this morning. It'll be at the clerk's office by 9. What's in it? I looked at the security conveyor belt and placed my bag on it. Enough, she didn't push. Sandra Ossie had been a public defender for 11 years before she went private. She had learned, in that time, that clients who said enough usually meant it. We went through security. I put my shoes back on standing up, without touching the wall, another habit so old I'd stopped noticing it. A young clerk by the door glanced at me the way people sometimes do, trying to place me, finding nothing to grab onto, moving on. That had been my professional life for 20 years, the kind of face people look at and don't remember. I had been trained to cultivate that quality, to sand down anything distinctive in my bearing until I read, to a casual observer, as simply a woman moving through a room on ordinary business. It had served me extraordinarily well in 12 countries. In my marriage, it had cost me more than I'd priced in. The courtroom doors were heavy and dark-stained. I put my hand on the brass handle and felt the familiar cold of it. Derek was inside. Margaret was inside. Whatever was about to happen was already in motion. Had been in motion. I was beginning to understand for much longer than 14 months. I pushed open the door. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I don't know why that surprised me. I had been in this building before, years ago, on different business entirely, the kind that doesn't get docketed. But I had never sat on the civilian side of a proceeding, never been the subject of one, and there is something about becoming the person a room is organized around that shrinks the architecture. The ceiling felt lower. The gallery felt closer. The flag in the corner behind the bench looked like it had been there since before I was born, its fringe slightly frayed at the bottom edge, and for some reason that detail steadied me. Derek was in the 3rd row on the left side, behind where Sandra and I would sit. He stood when I came in. That was the first thing he did, just stood up, the way you stand for someone you're not sure you still have the right to stand for. He was wearing the navy suit I had always liked on him, and his hair had more gray at the temples than I remembered, and when our eyes met, he did something complicated with his jaw that I recognized as him not letting himself cry in a federal courtroom. I gave him a small nod. He sat back down. I did not let myself look at him again for a long time after that. Not because I didn't want to, because I needed to be in the room I was actually in, and looking at Derek pulled me toward a different room entirely. The one where we were still okay, where I had not disappeared for 14 months, where his mother had not spent a year and a half dismantling whatever we had built. I couldn't afford that room right now. Margaret Hollis was already seated at the opposing table. She was a handsome woman in the way that certain kinds of power tend to produce. Precise haircut, silver and deliberate, wool suit in a shade of blue dark enough to mean business without being aggressive. Her reading glasses were on the table in front of her, folded. She did not look up when I entered. That was also deliberate. I had been in enough rooms with people who controlled their attention as a weapon to recognize the technique. Her lead attorney was a man named Clifford Pruitt. Mid-50s, former federal prosecutor, the kind of lawyer who had learned early that juries distrust men who seem to be enjoying themselves too much, and had spent 30 years carefully, performing reluctance. He was reviewing a document when I sat down and did not look up either. The two associates flanking him were younger, sharper looking, the kind of young that comes from not having slept enough for several years in a row. One of them did look up. Her eyes went to me, then to Sandra, then back to her notes. I clocked a slight tension in her left shoulder that told me she was less certain about today than her employer. Good. Sandra leaned close. Judge Carla Morrow, 17 years on the bench. She doesn't like theater. She especially doesn't like attorneys who mistake her courtroom for a television program. Keep that in mind. Understood, I said. You don't speak unless she addresses you directly or I tell you to. Not a word, not a reaction, not a, Sandra. What? I know how to be quiet in a room. She looked at me for a moment over the top of her glasses. Yes, she said finally. I imagine you do. Judge Morrow came in at 9:03. She was a compact woman, early 60s, with a face that had the particular quality of having seen so much nonsense that it had achieved a permanent state of calibrated neutrality. She sat. We sat. She opened a folder and read for a moment without acknowledging the room, which I respected. Then Pruitt stood and began. He was good. I'll give him that. He opened with sympathy. For Derek, for the Hollis family, for the difficulty of a situation that no one of goodwill would have wanted. He was measured. He was sorrowful. He painted Margaret as a mother who had watched her son's wife vanish without explanation, watched her son grieve alone, watched a marriage dissolve from the inside out, and who had, reluctantly, come to believe that the marriage itself had been built on a foundation of misrepresentation. Then he said the words I had been waiting for since I got the summons. Mrs. Powell, or whatever her legal name may prove to be, has no verifiable employment history prior to 2019. She has no family connections that can be confirmed. She has no documented record of residence, of education, of any of the ordinary anchors that establish a person as who they claim to be. He paused. Let that land. It is the position of the Hollis family that Derek Hollis was induced to marry a woman whose true identity, background, and intentions remain unknown, and that this constitutes a material misrepresentation sufficient to void the marriage contract entirely. Somewhere behind me, I heard the gallery shift. I did not turn around. Margaret had still not looked at me. I studied her profile, the set of her jaw, the way she had placed her hands on the table, flat, controlled, not folded, because folded hands read as either prayer or nerves, and she was neither. She had this before. Not this exact thing, but the architecture of it, the careful construction of a narrative, the prearranged weight of evidence, the patience to let someone else carry the first stone. She had done this her whole life. What she had not done, in her whole life, was sit across from someone who had been trained by the same institutions that trained her country's most protected secrets. Judge Morrow turned to Sandra. Counselor, Sandra stood. Her opening was shorter than Pruitt's by about 4 minutes, which was intentional. She said that the gaps in her client's verifiable record were not evidence of deception but of service, federal service of a nature that, by law, could not be fully disclosed in open court. She said that documentation had been requested through the appropriate channels and had been confirmed as forthcoming. She said that by the end of today's proceedings, the court would have what it needed to evaluate the full picture. Pruitt objected to the vagueness. Judge Morrow looked at him over her glasses. I'll allow it, Mr. Pruitt. Sit down. He sat. I watched Margaret Hollis's right hand, still flat on the table, press down very slightly harder against the wood. That was the first crack. Small. Almost nothing. But I had spent 20 years reading rooms through details smaller than that. She was not as certain as she looked. Somewhere in the back of the gallery, I heard a chair adjust. The soft complaint of wood taking on weight. Someone sitting down who had come in late. I didn't turn around to look. I wish, now, that I had. I would have seen the old man in the gray suit settle into the end of the last row, read the name on the docket sheet the clerk handed him, and go very still. But I didn't look. Not yet. The morning session ran until 11:40. In that time, Clifford Pruitt called 2 witnesses. introduced 14 exhibits, and used the phrase woman of unknown origin 4 times, which I counted because counting things is a habit I developed in circumstances where habits kept you alive. The first witness was a private investigator named Gerald Foss. Heavyset, precise, the kind of man who had learned to make tedium sound authoritative. He had been retained by Margaret 8 months ago. He had spent those 8 months attempting to construct a coherent biography of Zara Powell and had, by his own testimony, largely failed. No childhood address that held up past a second search. No high school yearbook photo. No college roommate who remembered her. Employment records that dead-ended at a contractor firm registered in Northern Virginia that had, upon inquiry, referred all questions to a legal department that never called back. Pruitt walked him through it methodically, exhibit by exhibit. Birth certificate, issued in Georgia, verified. Social security number, valid, but with a gap in reported income between 2004 and 2009 that Foss described as anomalous. Prior addresses, 3 in 10 years, none with a lease longer than 14 months, none with a neighbor who could describe her beyond quiet, kept to herself. I think she traveled for work. In your professional experience, Pruitt said, what does this pattern of records suggest? Foss adjusted his tie. In my professional experience, this pattern is consistent with either deliberate identity construction or significant efforts to minimize a personal footprint, and in plain English, someone who didn't want to be found, Sandra objected. Judge Morrow sustained it, struck the characterization, but the words had already done their work in the room the way words always do once they're out. You can rule them inadmissible, but you can't unhear them. I wrote nothing on my notepad. I had learned a long time ago not to write anything in a room where other people could read your reaction off your hands. The second witness was worse. Her name was Patricia Okafor. She had been Derek's family accountant for 11 years. She was a careful woman, clearly uncomfortable, clearly aware that she was being used as a vehicle for something she hadn't fully signed up for. She testified about the joint accounts Derek and I had opened after the wedding, the deposits, the transfers, the pattern of financial activity over 4 years of marriage. Pruitt asked her to characterize the deposits made from Zara Powell's income. They were irregular, Patricia said. Large amounts, infrequent, with no corresponding pay stub or W-2 that I was provided. And the source of those funds? I was told they were contract payments, federal contractor work, but you never saw documentation. No. So as far as the financial record shows, a significant portion of funds entering the joint marital account came from an unverified source. Patricia looked briefly at me. I gave her nothing to read. That's accurate, she said quietly. Pruitt let that sit for a moment. Then he turned to the judge. Your Honor, what we are establishing is a pattern, not just of obscured identity, but of obscured resources. Mrs. Powell, if that is indeed her name, inserted herself into a wealthy family, contributed funds of unknown origin to a joint account, and disappeared for over a year without legal notice, without contact, and without explanation. The Hollis family is not asking this court to punish anyone. They are asking this court to recognize that Derek Hollis entered a marriage contract under false pretenses and to grant appropriate relief. He sat down. Judge Morrow looked at Sandra. Counselor, you indicated documentation was forthcoming. Yes, Your Honor. We are expecting delivery to the clerk's office. Sandra checked her phone under the table. A motion so small only I caught it. A brief tightening around her eyes. It should be here within the hour. Within the hour, the judge repeated, Yes, Your Honor. Morrow looked at the clock on the wall, an old analog thing, the kind that makes a faint click on every minute. We'll recess until 1 o'clock. I expect whatever documentation you've referenced to be in my clerk's hands before we reconvene. She looked at Sandra over her glasses with an expression that was not unkind but left no room for interpretation. I don't like surprises after lunch, Ms. Osei. Understood, Your Honor? The gavel. The room stood. I stayed seated an extra beat, the way I always do in rooms I'm not sure about, and in that extra beat I heard, from somewhere behind me, A sound I had not heard in 4 years. A man clearing his throat in a specific way. Two short, one long. That had been, in a previous chapter of my life, a field signal meaning, I see you and you are not alone. I did not turn around. My hand, flat on the table, went very still. In the hallway during recess, Margaret Hollis passed within 6 feet of me. She was speaking in a low voice to Pruitt, and she did not look at me directly. But as she passed, she slowed by perhaps half a step, and I felt the specific quality of attention she was paying me, the kind that is trying very hard to look like nothing. "You're holding up well," she said. Not to me, technically, to the air in front of her, but calibrated to land. I said nothing. "That must be exhausting," she added. "All that composure." I looked at her then. Just briefly. She was a woman who had spent 68 years being the most formidable person in every room she entered, and she had the face of someone who had never had cause to doubt that. She was looking at me the way people look at a locked door, with the confidence of someone who believes they already have the key. "Margaret," I said. She stopped. That surprised her. I had never used her first name directly, not once in 4 years of marriage to her son. "I hope the rest of your morning is restful," I said. "This afternoon is going to ask more of you." She held my gaze for 3 seconds. Then Pruitt touched her elbow and they moved on. Sandra appeared at my side. "Was that necessary?" "No," I said. "Then why?" I watched Margaret's back as she turned the corner toward the attorney conference room. Because she needed to know that I'm not afraid of her. And she needed to know it before the file arrives. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then, the courier just confirmed. "Clerk's office received it at 11:53. I nodded. "Zara." Sandra's voice dropped. "I haven't opened it." "I didn't. They said it came with a handling restriction. Eyes of counsel and the bench only, pending the judge's discretion to unseal for record, I know, what is in that file." I watched the door Margaret had gone through. "The truth," I said, "which is the one thing she didn't account for." Judge Morrow reconvened at 1:04. She had the file. I knew she had read at least part of it during the recess because she came in differently than she had come in that morning. Not faster, not slower, but with a quality of stillness that had not been there before. The kind of stillness that settles over a person when they have just learned something that reorders their understanding of a room. I had seen it before on the faces of people receiving intelligence briefings for the first time. The world does not change, but your map of it does, suddenly and permanently, and for a moment your body has to catch up. She sat. She opened the folder in front of her. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. Pruitt shifted in his chair. "Ms. Osei," Judge Morrow said, "the documentation your client submitted has been received and reviewed by this court under the applicable handling guidelines. Before we proceed, I want to confirm for the record, your client is aware of the contents of this file." Sandra stood. "Yes, Your Honor. My client prepared the authorization for its release, and she understands that once I unseal the relevant portions for the record, those portions become part of the public proceeding?" "She does." The judge looked at me directly for the first time all day. I held her gaze. I had nothing to hide from her. That was the specific, clean feeling of this moment. Not triumph, not relief, just the uncomplicated steadiness of having nothing to hide. "Very well," Morrow said. She turned to Pruitt. "Counselor, your client has argued that the petitioner in this matter has no verifiable identity, no legitimate employment history, and no credible explanation for the gaps in her public record. Is that a fair summary of your position?" Pruitt stood. "It is, Your Honor. Then I'm going to read into the record what this court has received." She adjusted her glasses, looked down at the file, and began. She did not read all of it. What she read was a summary, 3 paragraphs, formal language, the kind of language that has had all the color sanded off it until only the weight remains. But even in that stripped-down form, even in the flat cadence of a judge reading aloud in a federal courtroom, what she was saying was this: that Zara Powell, née Zara Ann Calloway, had served as a commissioned officer in the United States Army from 2001 to 2011, attaining the rank of captain With 2 combat deployments and a service record that included commendations, this court was not at liberty to detail in open session that following her separation from active duty, she had been contracted by a federal intelligence agency, named in the sealed portion of the document, in a paramilitary advisory capacity, that her work in this capacity had been conducted undercover, requiring the deliberate minimization of her personal and financial footprint as a matter of operational security, that the irregular income deposits in the marital account were contract payments processed through a legitimate federal disbursement channel, documentation of which was included in the sealed exhibits, that the 14-month absence cited by the petitioner as evidence of abandonment had occurred during an active overseas assignment, the nature of which remained classified, but the existence and timeline of which were confirmed by the issuing agency, and that her operational call sign, used for the duration of her intelligence service, was Silkawire. The courtroom was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when everyone in them has just been asked to update what they thought they knew. Pruitt was on his feet before Morrow finished. Your Honor, the authenticity of this document. Sit down, Mr. Pruitt. The chain of custody alone, Mr. Pruitt. The judge's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. The document bears the seal of the issuing agency, a verification signature from the agency's Office of General Counsel, and a Federal Courier confirmation logged at 11:53 this morning. If you wish to challenge its authenticity, you are welcome to file the appropriate motion and argue it before me, at a date I will schedule for sometime next spring. She looked at him over her glasses. Sit down. He sat. Margaret Hollis had not moved. She was looking at the file on the judge's bench as if trying by sheer force of attention to read its sealed portions from across the room. Her hands were still flat on the table, but the pressure behind them was different now. Not the controlled stillness of a woman holding her ground. The stillness of a woman who has just realized the ground is not where she thought it was. I was watching her when it happened. From the back of the room, the last row of the gallery, the end seat near the door, a man stood up. He was tall even now, even at 74, with the particular upright quality of bearing that never fully leaves a person who has spent decades being the kind of man other people organize themselves around in a crisis. Gray suit, white shirt, no tie. The hands that had once signed deployment orders, for operations I still couldn't name, were folded in front of him, and his face, when I finally turned to look at him, was the face of someone who had just confirmed something they already suspected. Colonel James Atwater, retired, my first CO. The man who had taught me, in the summer of 2003, that silence was not the absence of communication but its most precise form, Your Honor, he said. The bailiff took a half step forward. Morrow raised one hand. Stop! She looked at the old man in the back row. Sir, this is an active proceeding. I understand that, Your Honor. I apologize for the interruption. His voice was the same as I remembered, unhurried, carrying easily without being raised, the voice of a man who had never needed to shout to be heard. My name is James Atwater, Colonel United States Army, retired. I was this woman's commanding officer for 6 years. A pause. I know exactly what that file says, and I know who she is. The room held its breath. Margaret Hollis turned in her chair for the first time all day and looked at the man in the back row. I watched her face move through something she had not prepared for, not fear. Not yet, but the precursor to it. The moment when a strategy encounters a variable it did not price in. Atwater was looking at me, not with pity. Not with the complicated mix of guilt and admiration I had seen on the faces of people who found out too late what someone had given. He was looking at me the way he had always looked at me in the field. The steady, even regard of a man who knew exactly what you were capable of and was simply confirming that you were still standing. I held his gaze for 1 second. Then I looked back at the front of the room, at the judge, at the file on the bench, at the quiet fact of the truth finally taking up the space it had always been owed. I did not smile. I didn't need to. Judge Morrow called a 15-minute recess after Atwater spoke. It stretched to 35. During that time, Pruitt and his associates disappeared into the attorney conference room with Margaret. Sandra took a call in the hallway. I sat at the table alone for a while, which I didn't mind. I have spent a significant portion of my adult life sitting alone in rooms, waiting for the next thing to happen, and I have made a kind of peace with it that most people never have to bother making. Atwater came and sat in the chair beside me. Not Sandra's chair, the one to my right, the one that had been empty all morning. He didn't say anything for a moment. Neither did I. That had always been one of the things I valued about him. He understood that silence between people who trust each other is not a problem requiring a solution. "You look tired," he said finally. "I am tired." "Good tired or bad tired?" "Both," he nodded. Put his hands on the table, those large, still hands. "Derek called me 3 weeks ago. Asked if I'd come. He didn't know," he paused. "He didn't know you and I had history. He just knew his father and I went back a long way, and he thought—" Another pause. "He thought maybe I could speak to your character. He thought you'd be a character witness." "Yes, and instead you're—" "Whatever the situation required," Atwater said. "Same as always, I looked at the frayed flag in the corner. I never told him," I said. "Derek, about any of it. The army, the work after. I told him federal contractor. I told him government work. I told him it sometimes meant being away for stretches and not being able to explain where. He accepted that. He trusted me. I stopped. I told myself the cover was for operational reasons, and it was, partly. But partly it was because I didn't know how to be that person with him, the person who had done those things. It was easier to let him know Zara Powell, who made good coffee and remembered his mother's birthday and was home most of the time. Atwater was quiet for a moment. Most of the time, I agreed. Outside the tall windows, the October sky had the flat, specific gray of a New England afternoon deciding whether to rain. I watched a pigeon navigate the window ledge for a moment, purposeful and unbothered. "Do you remember the Reyes situation?" I said. It was not a question. Atwater's hands shifted slightly on the table. "I remember everything about the Reyes situation. Then you know why I'm tired. Marcus Reyes had been my closest friend in uniform. We had met in our first deployment, 2 people who discovered, in the grinding sameness of a forward operating base in the summer heat, that they had the same specific and useless ability, BC, to identify every song that came on the radio within the first 3 notes, and a shared, inexplicable fondness for terrible instant coffee. He was from Albuquerque. He had a son named after his grandfather. He laughed at things other people found too dark to be funny, which in our line of work was not a flaw but a survival mechanism. He died in the 11th month of my second deployment. A night operation that went wrong in the specific way that things go wrong when someone on the inside has been talking to someone on the outside. We were 4 operatives, 1 target, 1 extraction window. The window closed 8 minutes early. Marcus went back to hold the corridor. He was 31 years old. The investigation that followed was the longest 2 years of my life. Someone had to be responsible for the intelligence failure, and the person most conveniently positioned to be responsible was the officer who had called the original approach angle, which was me. I had argued for a different entry point than the one in the initial plan. My argument was documented. My argument was, in the aftermath, characterized as the deviation that had cost us the extraction window. I was placed on administrative leave. My clearance was suspended. I sat in a government-issued apartment in Northern Virginia for 19 months while people I had never met read every document I had ever signed and every communication I had ever sent. At the end of those 19 months, they found what I had known all along was findable if someone looked with honest eyes, that the intelligence failure had not originated with my approach angle's decision, but had originated 6 weeks earlier in a source report that had been altered before it reached our team. Someone upstream had changed the numbers. I had made the correct call on incorrect data. My clearance was reinstated. I was offered reassignment. I accepted it because Marcus was dead, and the work was still necessary, and sitting in that Northern Virginia apartment for the rest of my life was not something I was willing to do. I never told anyone, in the years that followed, what those 19 months had felt like. Not because I couldn't find the words. I am reasonably good with words when I choose to use them, but because the experience of being accused of something you did not do, and of being unable to defend yourself fully because the truth is classified, sits in a part of you that ordinary conversation cannot reach. It settles there and becomes part of the architecture. You build around it. You learn the shape of it so well that after a while you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing a scar. Until someone puts you in a room and accuses you of being something you are not, and then you notice it again. Every part of it. His son reached to me, I told Atwater. Last year. Before the assignment, Marcus's boy. He found me through. I shook my head. It doesn't matter how. He's 28 now. He wanted to know what happened to his father. The real version, not the family notification letter. Did you tell him? Everything I'm cleared to tell. Which is most of it. I paused. He said, "Thank you. I didn't know what to do with that." Atwater looked at me sideways. "Yes, you did." I cried in my car in a parking garage in Bethesda for about 20 minutes. "That's what I meant," he said. The door to the attorney conference room opened down the hall. I heard Pruitt's voice, not the words. Just the cadence. The specific register of an attorney recalibrating. Margaret's voice underneath it. Lower, harder. The voice of a woman who has not yet decided to stop. Atwater stood, straightened his jacket. He had the unhurried quality of a man who has stood up in difficult rooms many times and learned that the standing up is the part that requires decision. Everything after that is just execution. "She's not done," I said. "No," he agreed. "But then neither are you." He went back to the gallery. I watched him go. Sandra came back in and sat beside me and opened her notepad and said nothing for a moment, which meant she was deciding how to say something she wasn't sure I wanted to hear. "What?" I said. Pruitt requested a brief continuation. "Morrow denied it." She paused. "But he's filed an emergency motion. He's arguing the Langley file was obtained under duress, that you compelled its release to avoid full financial disclosure." I looked at her. "I know," she said. "He's going to argue the file is a deflection." "Yes." "So we go back in there, and Margaret Hollis keeps going." "Yes." I straightened the edge of my notepad against the table, aligned it with the corner, exact. "Old habit." "Good," I said. I wasn't finished either. Pruitt's emergency motion took 40 minutes to argue, and 6 minutes for Judge Morrow to deny. She was not unkind about it. She simply noted, in the measured language of a person who has presided over enough proceedings to recognize a delay tactic on site, that the existence of a federal intelligence file did not preclude financial disclosure. It contextualized it, and that if opposing counsel wished to pursue the financial questions, the court remained available to hear them. What the court was not available to entertain was a procedural challenge to a document whose authenticity had been confirmed by 3 independent verification channels. Pruitt sat down with the face of a man who had known, going in, that the motion would fail and had filed it anyway because his client had asked him to, and he was being paid enough to ask no further questions. Margaret was very still beside him. She had been still in the way I recognized now. Not the controlled stillness of the morning, the performance of certainty, but a different kind. The stillness of a person doing rapid internal recalculation. I had seen it in the field, on the faces of people whose plan had just encountered reality and were deciding, in real time, how much of the original architecture was still salvageable. She was not finished, but she was rebuilding. That was when Sandra placed a second folder on the table in front of me. I looked at it. "Claire Atwater messengered this to my office this morning," Sandra said very quietly. "I didn't know what it was until 40 minutes ago when I read it in the hallway. I looked at the tab on the folder, saw the name of a law firm, not Claire's, a larger one, Washington-based. Saw a date that was 18 months before my last assignment. Saw, below that, a case reference number I did not recognize." "What is this?" I said. Read page 4, Sandra said. I opened the folder and turned to page 4. It took me approximately 90 seconds to read it. I am a fast reader, another trained habit, but I read it twice. Because the first time through, I was processing the words, and the second time I was processing what the words meant. Page 4 was an internal memo from a private intelligence consulting firm, the kind that exists in the space between government work and corporate risk management, staffed largely by former agency personnel who have decided that the private sector pays better and shoots at you less frequently. The firm's name was familiar to me in the distant way that names heard once in a corridor stay lodged in memory without context. The memo was addressed to a senior partner. It referenced a client. The client was identified by initials only, MH. But the billing address appended at the bottom was a law office in Boston, Massachusetts. And the name on the letterhead of that law office was Margaret Hollis, attorney at law, retired. The subject line of the memo read, Subject background, Z Powell, née Calloway. Operational history inquiry. The date was 22 months ago. 4 months before my last assignment began, I turned to page 5. The memo detailed what the firm had been asked to find, a full background on Zara Powell, with specific emphasis on the nature of her federal employment, the source of her income, and any vulnerabilities in her cover documentation that could be used to challenge her legal standing. Standard opposition research, the kind that happens in contested divorces involving significant assets, the kind I had known was coming from the moment I got the summons. But page 6 was not standard. Page 6 contained a name. The name was Robert Ainsley. He had been a senior analyst at a defense contractor with long-standing agency contracts, one of the firms that had processed source reports for our theater of operations in the year Marcus Reyes died. I had seen his name in the internal investigation documents. I had seen it and filed it and moved on because the investigation had cleared me, and the work was still necessary, and sitting still had never been an option. Robert Ainsley, according to page 6 of the memo, had been a personal contact of Gerald Hollis, Derek's father, for 11 years. They had met through a private equity circle in Boston. They had maintained a relationship that included, according to financial records appended to the memo, 3 wire transfers over a period of 18 months, totaling an amount I will not say out loud, because saying it out loud would make me want to do something I would not be proud of. The memo noted, with the detached professionalism of people paid to find dirt without asking why it's wanted, that Ainsley had been the source of the original inquiry to this firm, that he had approached them on behalf of MH, with the specific request to find whatever existed in Zara Powell's record that could be used against her. Robert Ainsley, the man whose altered source report had cost Marcus Reyes his life. The man whose name had been in the investigation file and then, quietly, had not been in the final report. The man who had, apparently, spent the years since moving laterally into private consulting and maintaining old relationships in old cities, including a relationship with the family of the man I had married. I closed the folder. The courtroom sounds came back to me in pieces, the ventilation system, the clerk typing, someone in the gallery shifting in their seat. I became aware that my hands were very flat and very still on the table, and that Sandra was watching me with the careful attention of someone monitoring a controlled reaction. "How long have you had this?" I said. 40 minutes, Sandra said. "I told you as soon as I understood what it was. Claire Atwater found this. Her firm has been doing private intelligence work for 3 years. She recognized Ainsley's name from," Sandra paused, "from her father's files, apparently. Atwater kept records. He kept everything." I thought about that. About a 74-year-old retired colonel sitting in his study somewhere, keeping files, maintaining the kind of institutional memory that official records are not always permitted to hold. I thought about what that cost over years, the weight of knowing things you cannot always use, carrying them anyway, because someday the right room might appear. He had walked into my room today. Margaret Hollis hired a firm that was connected to Robert Ainsley, I said. Not a question. Working it aloud? Yes. And Ainsley is connected to the intelligence failure that killed my partner. That is what this suggests. She didn't know that, I said slowly. Margaret didn't know that part. She hired the firm to dig up dirt on my record. She didn't know the firm's contact was the man whose altered report. I stopped, breathed. She didn't know. But she knew the record had gaps she could exploit, and someone made sure she knew exactly where to look. Sandra said nothing. Ainsley pointed her at me. I said, "He knew who I was. He knew about the investigation. He knew my name had been in those files, and when I married into a family he had connections to, he made sure that information traveled in a useful direction." The recess buzzer sounded. I sat for one more moment with the folder under my hands. Margaret Hollis had walked into this courtroom this morning, believing she held every card in the deck. She had the investigator. She had the financial records. She had a narrative built on 14 months of absence and a marriage that looked, from the outside, like exactly what she said it was. She did not know that the file from Langley also contained, in its sealed portion, the name Robert Ainsley, flagged as a person of interest in an ongoing internal review that had been quietly reopened 6 months ago. She did not know that her connection to him was now in Sandra's hands. She did not know that the old man in the gray suit in the back row had a daughter who had spent 3 years learning where the bodies were buried. She had come here to bury me. She had dug in exactly the wrong place. Claire Atwater walked into the courtroom at 2:31 in the afternoon. I had not met her before that moment. I knew her name from Atwater. He had mentioned her once, years ago, with the specific restraint of a father who is proud of something and has decided that saying so directly would embarrass them both. My daughter went into law, he had said. Good at it, that was all. From Atwater. That was a considerable endorsement. She was 43 too. With her father's quality of deliberate stillness and her own quality of precision. The kind of woman who moved through rooms as though she had already mapped them. Dark suit, minimal jewelry, a leather document case under her arm that looked like it weighed more than it should. She spoke briefly to Sandra at the door, handed over a second envelope, then took a seat in the front row of the gallery directly behind our table. Margaret Hollis watched her come in. I watched Margaret watch her. There was a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, where Margaret's eyes went from Claire to the document case to Sandra, and something moved across her face that she did not entirely manage to control. Not fear. Margaret Hollis was not a woman who admitted fear, even to herself, but recognition. The specific recognition of a person who has just identified a threat they had not accounted for in their original plan. She leaned to Pruitt, said something low and fast. Pruitt looked at Claire, looked back at Margaret. His expression was the expression of a man being asked to defend a position he is no longer certain is defensible. Judge Morrow reconvened. "Ms. Ossie," she said. "I understand there have been additional developments." Sandra stood. "Yes, Your Honor. My co-counsel Claire Atwater has joined these proceedings. She brings additional documentary evidence material to the court's evaluation of the circumstances surrounding this marriage and its dissolution." Pruitt was on his feet. "Your Honor, we object to the introduction of last minute." "Noted," Morrow said. "Ms. Atwater, please approach." Claire came forward, presented her credentials, handed the envelope to the clerk. Then she stood at the bar with her hands at her sides and addressed the judge in a voice that had the same quality as her father's. No performance in it, just information delivered at the precise weight required, Your Honor. The documents I am submitting establish a connection between a private intelligence firm retained by the petitioner in this matter, that is Margaret Hollis, and an individual named Robert Ainsley, formerly of Sentinel Defense Analytics, a federal contractor. Mr. Ainsley was identified as a person of interest in an internal review related to my client's prior government service. The evidence suggests that Mr. Ainsley directed the petitioner toward specific vulnerabilities in my client's public record, with knowledge of her covert history, as part of an effort to facilitate this legal action. The room went quiet in the particular way it had gone quiet when Morrow read from the Langley file. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of people doing rapid, private arithmetic. Pruitt said, "Your Honor, this is an extraordinary claim." "It is," Claire said, turning to him with a courtesy that was somehow colder than argument. "Which is why I've brought the billing records, the wire transfer documentation, and 2 sworn affidavits from former employees of the firm confirming the nature of the engagement." She looked back at the judge. Mr. Ainsley knew my client's operational history. He knew her record contained gaps that could be exploited in a civil proceeding, and he made sure the right person knew where to look. Pruitt turned to his associates. One of them was already on her phone, half turned away. The other had gone very still in the specific way of someone who has just decided to begin mentally separating themselves from the outcome of this proceeding. Margaret had not moved. I was watching her the way I had been trained to watch things, peripherally, without directing full attention, which allows you to catch the small movements that direct attention suppresses. Her jaw, her hands, the set of her shoulders. She was doing what she always did, processing, recalibrating, deciding which parts of the original strategy could survive contact with this new reality. But there was something underneath the recalibration that I had not seen on her face before today. She had not known about Ainsley's history with me. I was certain of that now. She had hired a firm, been pointed at a target, been given a roadmap to my record's vulnerabilities. She had followed the roadmap because it led where she already wanted to go, to the conclusion that I was not good enough, not real enough, not worthy of her son. She had not asked why the roadmap existed. She had not asked who had drawn it, or what they stood to gain from her using it. She was a formidable woman who had made the mistake that formidable people sometimes make, the mistake of assuming that wanting something to be true is sufficient substitute for verifying that it is. Judge Morrow reviewed Claire's submission in silence for several minutes. The courtroom waited. I heard the clock on the wall click through 4 minutes. Then Morrow set the documents down and looked at Pruitt, counselor. "Your client has built this proceeding on the argument that the respondent's lack of verifiable public record constitutes evidence of deception. Is that correct?" "That is correct, Your Honor. The court now has documentation establishing that the respondent's record gaps are consistent with classified federal service, confirmed by the issuing agency. The court also has documentation suggesting that your client was directed to exploit those gaps by an individual with a personal connection to your client's and a documented history in matters related to the respondent's service." She paused. "In light of this, does your client wish to modify her position?" Pruitt turned to Margaret. She looked at him. Then she looked at the bench. Then, for the first time since I had walked through that door this morning, she looked directly at me. It was not the look I had expected. I had expected calculation, a final assessment, a last attempt to find the angle. What I saw instead was something older and more complicated. The look of a woman who had spent her whole life being the most prepared person in the room, confronting the specific humiliation of having been used, of having been handed a weapon by someone she trusted and pointed at a target and told it was righteous, without ever being told the full truth of why. She did not know Robert Ainsley had gotten Marcus Reyes killed. She did not know she had been someone else's instrument. In that moment, looking at her, I felt something I had not anticipated feeling, not sympathy, not forgiveness. Those would come later, or they wouldn't, and I was not going to manufacture them in a federal courtroom for the sake of a clean ending. But something adjacent to understanding. The recognition that the person sitting across from me had been lied to, in a different way than I had been lied to, but lied to nonetheless. That the room we were both in had been arranged by someone neither of us had fully seen. Pruitt turned back to the judge. "Your Honor," he said. His voice had lost its morning certainty. "My client requests a brief recess to consult with counsel." Morrow looked at him for a moment. 30 minutes, she said. The 30 minutes came and went. then another 20 on top of that, during which Sandra and Claire sat on either side of me at the table, and we did not speak very much, because there was nothing useful left to say that had not already been said in the form of documents on a judge's bench. Claire had her father's quality of comfortable silence. I appreciated that. At some point during the wait, Derek appeared at the low gate that separated the gallery from the council tables. He stood there for a moment, not quite crossing it, like a man at a threshold he is not certain he has the right to cross. I looked at him. He said, very quietly, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said, "about my mother, about Ainsley, about any of—" He stopped, pressed his hand briefly to the back of the chair beside me without sitting down. "I didn't know, Derek." "Yeah, I know," I said again. "That's enough for right now." He nodded, went back to his seat. I watched him sit down and put his elbows on his knees and look at the floor for a long moment. And I thought about the particular loneliness of being the person in the room with the least information, and how that loneliness compounds over 14 months into something that can be mistaken from the outside for a decision. At 3:47, the conference room door opened and Pruitt walked back in alone. He looked like a man who had aged 4 years and 50 minutes. He sat down, arranged his papers with the careful attention of someone who needs to do something with his hands, and when Morrow reconvened, he stood and spoke in the measured, emptied-out tone of an attorney delivering a position he did not originate. Margaret Hollis was withdrawing her challenge to the validity of the marriage. She was withdrawing her claim that the respondent had misrepresented her identity or her intentions. She was, and Pruitt said this with the specific care of someone reading language that had been negotiated word by word, acknowledging that the respondent's service record, as confirmed by the issuing federal agency, constituted a legitimate and lawful explanation for the gaps in her public documentation. He sat down. Morrow looked at Sandra. "Miss Ossie." Sandra stood. "The respondent accepts the withdrawal, Your Honor. We ask that the court note for the record that no finding of misrepresentation or fraud has been established against Zara Powell, and that her marital standing and associated rights remain fully intact." "So noted," Morrow said. She was writing when the gallery door opened. I did not turn around immediately. I heard it. The soft percussion of the door, then footsteps, more than one person, moving with the specific, unhurried quality of people who have somewhere to be and know it. Then Sandra touched my arm, very lightly, and I turned. There were 4 of them. The first was a man in his late 60s, broad-shouldered, moving with the slight deliberateness of a knee that had been repaired at least once. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, open collar, but his bearing announced him more clearly than any uniform would have. Behind him came 2 women, one in her 50s, one younger, both with the alert stillness of people who have spent time in places where stillness is a professional requirement. And behind them, last through the door, was a young man, 28 years old, dark-eyed, with his father's jaw and his father's way of holding his shoulders, like he was bracing against something only he could feel. Marcus Reyes, Jr. He had called me 3 weeks before my last assignment from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, he had said, "Miss Powell, my name is Marcus Reyes. I think you knew my father." And I had stood in my kitchen in the gray morning light and not said anything for a moment that was probably too long, and then I had said, "Yes, I did." He was my closest friend. He had not told me he was coming today. I had not asked him to. He had found out about the proceedings the way people find things out when they are determined and have learned. From a father they barely knew, that information is worth pursuing. He sat in the second row, met my eyes briefly, gave me the smallest nod, the man in the dark jacket. I recognized him now, after a moment. Chief Warrant Officer Dale Purcell, retired, who had been on the same forward operating base in the same summer, a lifetime ago. He addressed the judge. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. My name is Dale Purcell. These individuals and I served alongside the respondent in this matter during her military service. We became aware of these proceedings and came voluntarily. We are prepared to offer testimony, if the court finds it appropriate, regarding the respondent's character and the nature of her service. Morrow looked at them for a moment. Then she looked at Pruitt. Pruitt's face said everything his voice did not. "Mr. Pruitt," the judge said, "your client has withdrawn her principal claims. Is there a remaining basis on which character testimony would be contested?" He was quiet for a moment. "No, Your Honor." "Then I'll hear it," Morrow said. Briefly, what followed was not long. That was the thing about it that I will carry the longest, that it did not need to be long. Dale Purcell spoke for 4 minutes. He spoke about a night operation in the 11th month of a deployment, about an extraction window, about a decision made under pressure with incomplete information that he had watched be mischaracterized for 2 years in a proceeding he was not permitted to testify in. He said, without drama, that Zara Powell had made the correct call, that the intelligence failure had not originated with her, that he had wanted to say so for 20 years and had been waiting for a room where he was allowed. One of the 2 women, Staff Sergeant Rita Campos, retired, spoke for 2 minutes. She said she would trust Zara Powell with her life, had trusted her with her life, and that the word gold digger did not belong in the same room as the woman sitting at that table. The younger woman, whose name was Lieutenant Danielle Park, said only one sentence. She said, "She brought our people home when nobody else was coming." Then Marcus Reyes Jr. stood up. He did not address the judge. He addressed the room. He was 28 years old, and he had grown up with a flag and a letter and a photograph. And he stood in that courtroom with the specific dignity of a person who has spent their whole life carrying something heavy and has decided in this moment to set it down in the right place. "My father died on a mission she was blamed for," he said. "I spent a long time being angry about that. Angry at everyone, including her." He paused. "Then she told me the truth, the whole truth. Everything she was cleared to say, and then a little more, because she decided I deserved it." He looked at me. "She didn't have to do that. She could have let me keep the wrong version. It would have been easier for her." Another pause. "My father trusted her with his life. I think that's worth saying out loud, in a room where people have been saying other things." He sat down. The courtroom was very quiet. I was looking at the frayed flag in the corner, the one that had steadied me that morning when the ceiling felt too low. I was not going to cry in a federal courtroom. I had decided that at 7:41 in the parking garage, and I was going to honor that decision. I felt Derek's hand touch the back of my chair, very gently, from the row behind. I did not turn around, but I did not move away. Judge Morrow closed the proceedings at 4:22 in the afternoon. She did not editorialize. That was not her style, and I had come to appreciate her style enormously over the course of one very long day. She noted the withdrawal of the principal claims. She noted the confirmation of the respondent's federal service record. She noted, for the permanent record of the court, that no finding of fraud, misrepresentation, or identity deception had been established against Zara Powell. She ordered the sealed exhibits to remain sealed. She thanked the voluntary witnesses for their testimony. She closed her folder. Then she looked up, and for a moment she looked not at the attorneys or the parties, but at the room itself, the gallery, the witnesses, the old man in the gray suit in the back row, the young man with his father's jaw in the second row. And her expression had the quality of someone who has seen a great deal and has learned to recognize, when it appears, something that looks like the truth finding its way into the right room at last. She said nothing more. She didn't need to. The gavel, the room stood. I sat for an extra beat, same as always. Old habit. And in that beat, I heard the room begin to release. The exhale of wood and breath and shuffled papers, the soft collision of people moving toward each other or away, the specific sound of a proceeding that has ended not with a bang but with the quiet, irreversible fact of resolution. Sandra put her hand briefly on my arm. "It's done," she said. "I know. How are you?" I thought about that for a moment with genuine attention, the way you think about a question when someone asks it and means it. "I don't know yet," I said. "Ask me in a week." She nodded. That was enough for Sandra. She began gathering her papers with the efficient, practiced movements of a woman who has closed many difficult rooms and knows that the closing is its own kind of work. Derek was waiting in the hallway. He had his jacket over his arm and his hands in his pockets, and he was standing slightly apart from the dispersing crowd, looking at the floor with the specific focused attention of a man who is rehearsing what he wants to say and discarding each version as insufficient. He looked up when I came through the door, and whatever he had been rehearsing apparently dissolved, because he said nothing for a moment, and neither did I. "Thank you for coming," I said finally. It was not what I had planned to say. I had not planned anything, which was unusual for me and felt, in this particular context, correct. "It's my name on the docket too," he said. "I know." He was quiet. A paralegal from Pruitt's firm moved past us with her head down, pulling a rolling case that caught briefly on the doorframe. We both watched her go. "I'm sorry," Derek said. "You don't have to." "I do." He said it firmly. The way he said things when he had decided they needed to be said and was not going to be argued out of them. "I waited 8 months before He stopped. "She told me you weren't coming back. She said people who do what you do, whatever she thought you did, they use people and then they move on to the next thing. She said you had probably already moved on." He pressed his lips together. I wanted to not believe her. But 14 months it's a long time to be the only person in a house. "I know," I said. "I know it is. I should have waited longer, Derek. I should have. Maybe," I said. "But you didn't have the information you needed to make a different call. I know something about that, about what it costs to make decisions with incomplete information." "I don't." I stopped. Started again. "I'm not angry at you. I want to be clear about that. What I am is tired. And I think we both have a lot of things to say to each other that aren't going to fit into a courthouse hallway on the day the proceedings close." He looked at me for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, they're not, so let's not try to fit them here." He nodded, looked down. "Then, can I take you to dinner? Not tonight. Whenever you're ready. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere we can actually," he gestured. A small, slightly helpless gesture that I recognized as Derek searching for the right word and not finding it. "Talk," I said. "Talk," he agreed. "Yes," I said. "Whenever I'm ready. Which is not tonight, but—" "Yes," he breathed out. Just once, and not dramatically, but with the quality of a man releasing something he had been holding for a long time. "Okay," he said. "Okay." We stood there for another moment in the way that people stand when something has been resolved. But the resolution is so new it hasn't yet taken on a shape they recognize. Then he put his jacket on and said he would call me, and I said I would answer. And he walked toward the elevator with the particular gait of a man who is not entirely sure what he's walking toward but has decided, for the first time in a while, that walking is the right direction. I watched him go. Then I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Atwater, with Claire beside him. He looked at me with that steady, even regard. "You doing all right?" "Better than this morning. That's a low bar." "It clears it," Claire smiled. A brief, clean smile with her father's quality of saying more than it looked like it was saying. "The Ainsley matter," she said. "We've referred the documentation to 2 contacts. One federal, one adjacent. It won't disappear." "I didn't think it would," I said. "Not with you holding it." She gave me a card, which I put in my coat pocket without looking at it, and said she would be in touch. Then she touched her father's arm briefly and went to find the elevator, moving through the thinning hallway crowd with the same mapped room quality she had brought in with her. Atwater and I stood in the quiet of the nearly empty corridor. "Your father's building is still there," I said. "Off Tremont. I drove past it on the way in." "It is," Atwater said. "Derek's never sold it." No, a pause. Outside the tall courthouse windows, the October sky had decided against rain after all, and was doing something gentler. The low amber of late afternoon, the specific light that makes even granite look briefly warm. "Marcus Jr.," I said. What he said in there I heard. "I didn't ask him to come. I know you didn't." Atwater looked at the light on the windows. "He came because he wanted to." That's what it looks like when someone does something because they mean it and not because they were pointed at it. I thought about that for a moment. She didn't know, I said. Margaret, about what Ainsley was. About what he'd done. No, Atwater agreed. She didn't. That doesn't make what she did. No, he said, it doesn't. But it changes the shape of it. He was quiet for a moment. She's going to have to live with having been someone's instrument. That's not nothing. For a woman like that, that might be the hardest part of today. I looked at the amber light on the windows. She has a son who still loves her, I said. That's more than some people get to keep. Atwater looked at me sidelong. You thinking about forgiving her? I'm thinking about the fact that forgiveness and accountability aren't the same room, I said. They're adjacent. You can be in one without being in the other. At least for a while, he nodded slowly. You always did think in terms of rooms, occupational habit. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder, one squeeze, firm and brief, the way he had always done it in the field when words were not the right tool. Then he straightened his jacket, the same way he had in the courtroom, and said he needed to find his car. I watched him walk down the hallway toward the entrance, the old man in the gray suit with the frayed flag of bearing he would carry until he couldn't anymore. Then I put on my coat, picked up my bag, and walked out of the courthouse into the October light. A year is a strange unit of time. It is long enough for things to change, and short enough that the change surprises you anyway. The way a room you have lived in for years can suddenly look different in a particular light, and you stand in the doorway thinking, when did that happen? How did I not notice? It is October again. I am sitting on the back porch of a house in Concord, Massachusetts, 22 miles outside Boston, with a cup of coffee that has gone lukewarm, because I have been sitting here long enough to forget to drink it. The yard has the particular beauty of New England in the fall, maple at the back fence gone entirely red, the smell of cold coming in from the north, the light doing that amber thing it does in the late afternoon this time of year that makes everything look like a memory, even while it's happening. Derek is inside. I can hear him moving around the kitchen, the small domestic sounds of a man making dinner in a house that belongs to both of them now. We are not entirely repaired. I want to say that plainly because I think there is a version of this story, the clean version, the one that ties off, where the courtroom ends and the marriage resumes, and everyone finds their footing without further difficulty. That version is not true. What is true is that we have been doing the slower, harder work of two people learning to be in the same room again when one of them has been somewhere the other couldn't follow, and neither of them quite knows how to account for the distance. We are doing it anyway. That is enough for today, and most days that is enough. And on the days it isn't, I try to remember that I have sat in rooms with no exit and no daylight and found my way out of them, and that this particular difficulty, the human one, the one with no operational solution, is not worse than those rooms. It is different. It asks different things. I am still learning what it asks. The Ainsley matter closed quietly in the spring. I will not say more than that, because some things are not mine to say in full, and I have spent enough of my life knowing which those are. What I will say is that the documentation Claire Atwater referred to her contacts did not disappear, and that Robert Ainsley is no longer consulting for firms with federal contracts, and that the internal review that had been quietly reopened 6 months before the court proceedings reached a finding that was, finally, the right one. Marcus Reyes's service record was amended. It had not been wrong in the ways that mattered most, but it had carried a shadow that did not belong to him, and the shadow is gone now. I sat in my car in a parking garage in Bethesda when I found out and cried for about 20 minutes. Same garage, different Tuesday, called Marcus Jr. afterward. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Does it change anything?" And I said, "Not the thing that can't be changed, but it changes what the record says. And the record is what people read when they're trying to understand what someone's life meant." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Yeah, okay. Yeah, and I think for both of us that was sufficient. Margaret Hollis called me in February, I did not expect that. I had thought, when the proceedings closed, that we would settle into the particular arrangement of two people who are connected by someone they both love and have decided, by mutual unspoken agreement, never to be in the same room voluntarily. I had made a kind of peace with that arrangement. She called on a Tuesday evening. I was making dinner. I almost didn't answer. She said, "I owe you an apology." I know that doesn't. I know there's no version of it that covers what I did. But I owe you one, and I've been sitting with it long enough that not saying it has become worse than saying it badly. I sat down at the kitchen table. She told me she had not known about Ainsley, that she had hired the firm because she had wanted, badly, to be right about me, had wanted the story she had told herself about her son's marriage to be true. Because the alternative was admitting that she had spent 4 years being wrong about someone, and that her wrongness had cost her son something she could not give back. She said that when she found out, in the days after the proceedings, what Ainsley had done, what he had been connected to, she had sat with that for a long time, being used. Being pointed at someone and told it was righteous without being told the full truth. She said it was the most humbling experience of her 70-year life. I believed her. I did not forgive her that phone call. Forgiveness is not a door I can open in a single motion. It is more like a room I approach gradually, and I am somewhere in the hallway now, and that is honest progress. What I told her was that I heard her, that I believed she meant what she said, that Derek loved her, and I was not going to be the reason that became complicated. She said, "Thank you," very quietly. I said, "Don't thank me yet. Come to dinner in the spring. We'll see how the room feels." She came in April. It was strange and careful, and nobody said anything especially profound, and Derek made his mother's pot roast recipe, which she pretended not to notice, and at some point in the evening, I caught her looking at me across the table with an expression I recognized as a woman updating a very long-held understanding. And I looked back at her with something I hope she read correctly, which was, "We are not done, but we are starting." Atwater came to Concord last month. He sat on this same porch and drank coffee that also went lukewarm and watched the yard with the expression of a man who has learned to receive beauty without feeling he has to do anything about it. We talked about Marcus, about the amended record, about his daughter's firm and the work she was building. We talked about Derek for a while, and about the specific strangeness of constructing a life that looks ordinary from the outside, when the inside has been anything but. At some point he looked at me and said, "You know, when you first came under my command, you were the most controlled person I had ever supervised. No visible edges. Nothing to grab onto. That was the point," I said. "I know," he said. "But I always wondered, where did you put it all?" I thought about that. "Same place everyone does," I said. "Into the work, into the people you trust, into rooms that hold it when you can't." He nodded slowly. Then he said, "You know what silk wire means. You know the official version. I know it. Silk because you never heard her coming." He paused. "But the second part, wire, that was Reyes who named it. You know that?" I looked at him. He said wire because once you wrapped around a problem, it didn't let go. Atwater looked at the red maple at the back fence. But he also said, and I never told you this because there was no right time until now. He said it because wire holds things together. The invisible kind, the kind underneath. The kind nobody sees. He looked at me. He said that was you. I sat with that for a long moment. The light was doing the amber thing again, the late October thing. The thing that makes everything look like a memory even while it's happening. I picked up my lukewarm coffee and drank it anyway. If you have made it to the end of this story, I want you to do one thing before you go. Think of someone in your life who has carried something quietly, something you didn't know about, something they never asked you to acknowledge. Send them a message. Not a long one, just enough to say, "I see you." That's all it takes sometimes. That's all it ever took.